Okay, I know what some of you are thinking. Procol Harum Live was not the first symphonic rock album. There were plenty of examples before it. Days of Future Past by the Moody Blues, of course, was one of the very first of the genre, and people who are fans of Deep Purple and of Emerson, Lake and Palmer, respectively, will of course point out that Deep Purple made their album with an orchestra a good 2 years before Procol Harum made theirs, and the Nice, near the end of their existence, would make one as well, Five Bridges. That's all very true, and of course, there are plenty of bands, including no less than the Beatles, the Rolling Stones, and the 1960s incarnation of the Bee Gees, that made records using full orchestration in the studio. But Procol Harum Live has a very special place, for two reasons. In the first place, on the earlier albums that featured symphonic orchestration, like Days of Future Past, the Deep Purple and Nice albums, the orchestra was not fully integrated with the work being done by the rock bands in question. Typically, the suites would be arranged where the rock band would play, they would stop, and the orchestra would play a piece, and then the rock band would come back. It was very rarely, if ever, the case on these records where the orchestra and the rock band were playing together in a fully integrated fashion. On the recordings by the Beatles, Stones, Bee Gees, and other bands of the 1960s, the orchestration was almost always done from outside of the band as well. The Beatles' orchestrations were almost exclusively done by George Martin, who was exceptional at arranging horns and strings. Bill Shepherd would do that work for the Bee Gees, and various orchestrators, including Led Zeppelin's John Paul Jones, would work with the Stones over the course of their 1960s recordings. Where Procol Harum Live is truly unique is that throughout the album, the band and the orchestra are fully integrated. And that's not an accident. Gary Brooker, Procol Harum's singer and pianist, was the person responsible for the orchestrations. The story behind the album is an interesting one. By late 1971, when Procol Harum recorded Procol Harum Live in Edmonton, Alberta, the band had gone through quite a few changes. They had been successful in the United States throughout their existence. Their recent albums, A Salty Dog in 1969, Home in 1970, and Broken Barricades in 1971, had all charted fairly well in the States, and perhaps more importantly to the band, in their native England, the band was beginning to see chart action with their albums as well. The band, however, was not as successful on the singles charts. They, of course, had had a huge hit in 1967 with their first single release, A Whiter Shade of Pale, which would go on to sell millions of copies globally and achieve over 10 million radio airplays over the course of time. But in England, for all intents and purposes, Procol was a one-hit wonder on the singles chart. Their albums had begun to chart in England, starting with A Salty Dog. But their chart placement in their native country was generally not as good as it was in other countries, and in particular, it was not as good as it was in the United States. Procol Harum was a band that had its greatest success stateside. By this time, Procol Harum had gone through some personnel changes in the band as well. Following the making of A Salty Dog, the band's organist, Matthew Fisher, who produced that album, elected to leave, with the band's bass player, Dave Knights, leaving fairly close behind. Knights and Fisher were jointly replaced by a friend of the band, Chris Copping, who had played with Gary Brooker previously in the band which might be considered as the precursor to Procol Harum, the Paramounts. This, however, placed Robin Trower in an awkward position that I suspect he wasn't particularly happy with. Chris Copping could play both the organ and the bass guitar, but in a live setting, of course, he wouldn't be able to do both at the same time. In particular, on songs where Copping played organ, Robin Trower would be relegated to playing the bass, and Robin Trower, of course, was an excellent guitar player that I'm sure would much rather be playing his first instrument of choice. Robin Trower was also becoming much more interested in contributing songs to the band. He was more frequently collaborating with the band's lyricist, Keith Reed, on songs, and taking the occasional vocal on songs as well. It appeared inevitable that Trower would at some point leave the band, and Broken Barricades, recorded in the winter months of 1971, would indeed be Trower's last recording with Procol Harum. It apparently was decided, as Broken Barricades was being readied for release, that Trower would leave the band relatively shortly, but not before he would participate in several important gigs to help promote the album in the United States. Most notably, in mid-April of 1971, right around the time that Broken Barricades was issued stateside, Robin Trower and Procol Harum appeared on a radio concert in New York City for WPLJ-FM. WPLJ had a monthly concert series that featured numerous popular bands at the time, perhaps the most notable being Elton John, whose 11-17-70 album came from his show over the airwaves at WPLJ. Procol Harum's show was not issued in the same fashion on record, but recordings of that show are available here on YouTube, and I would suggest that you check those out if you haven't heard them before. This shows a band that is clicking on all cylinders, despite the fact that Procol was still operating as a four-piece at this point in time. By late April, the transition was made to bring on a new guitar player in Procol Harum. Robin Trower left and was replaced by Dave Ball on guitar, and a full-time bassist, Alan Cartwright, was also brought in, allowing Chris Copping to switch over to keyboards full-time, now giving Procol Harum a two-keyboard attack with Copping on organ and Gary Brooker on piano in live settings, and this proved to be rather formidable. In this time frame, Procol Harum received an invitation from the Edmonton Symphony Orchestra to come to Edmonton to record with them for a live audience. This was an opportunity that excited Gary Brooker particularly. It gave him the opportunity to provide orchestration for several others of Procol Harum's songs, besides the two that he orchestrated for A Salty Dog, that album's title song, and another track from the album, All This and More. And so the band agreed to do the show. Two interesting occurrences happened along the way. The first was that while this was a unique opportunity for the band, this was not an opportunity that was brokered by Procol Harum's American record company, A&M Records. A&M by this time was recognizing that they probably wouldn't have Procol Harum recording for them for very much longer. Procol Harum had recently changed record labels in the UK, moving away from EMI's Regal Zonophone label to Chrysalis Records. And it was becoming clear with the success of several of Chrysalis's bands, most notably Jethro Tull in the United States, that Chrysalis would eventually build an American operation, at which point Procol Harum would almost certainly move over to that label instead. So A&M had not participated in any of the arrangements for the show in Edmonton. Gary Brooker ultimately had the idea, however, that given that this was a special event, that it really should be captured on tape. And he approached A&M Records about the possibility of doing a recording. A&M agreed to make arrangements to record the show, but that agreement apparently was reached only a week before the show took place, so things had to come together rather quickly. To A&M's credit, they didn't do this on the cheap. They reached out to Wally Heider in Los Angeles, who brought his mobile truck up to Edmonton for the occasion. The recording of Procol Harum Live is outstanding. It is very well done from both a recording and a mixing and mastering perspective. The other thing that turned out to be rather interesting was, in preparing for the show in Edmonton, Brooker orchestrated about an hour's worth of material for the show. He decided last minute to orchestrate one more song that he thought would go particularly well with a sitting orchestra, a song from Procol Harum's first album, Conquistador. Legend has it that Conquistador was orchestrated by Gary Brooker while seated on an airplane en route to Edmonton, and that the orchestra did not see the charts for Conquistador until the day of the performance. If in fact the recording of Conquistador that we hear on Procol Harum Live is the very first time the orchestra played it, the orchestra was, like the band was, clicking on all cylinders this particular night. The single of Conquistador that would ultimately be released from Procol Harum Live was Procol Harum's biggest hit worldwide, other than for A Whiter Shade of Pale. Conquistador in the United States reached number 16 on the singles charts and was a fixture of the summer of 1972 on radio. Of the 10 songs that ultimately were recorded in November of 1971 for Procol Harum Live, 5 would make their way onto the album itself. Conquistador, which we've just mentioned, led the album off. The second song on the album, the apocalyptic Wailing Stories, taken from the band's album Home, was the second track, and it is wonderfully dramatic, including not only the orchestra playing with the band, but various special effects, including one of an explosion that is meant in this context to represent the sound of thunder. The majestic A Salty Dog is next, in a very similar arrangement, understandably so, to the one that was presented on the Salty Dog album 2 years before. That is followed by All This and More, and again, roughly the same arrangement as was presented on A Salty Dog. All This and More is a fine song, but in this context, it's probably the weakest song on the album. I personally would have much preferred if Gary Brooker had done a proper orchestration of A Whiter Shade of Pale and included it here. He elected not to do that, however. A Whiter Shade of Pale was not presented in Edmonton this particular night. I can't say that I know the reason as to why. It wouldn't surprise me to hear that the band considered the song as something of a millstone around their neck. And in any event, with A&M now being involved in the recording of the concert, they might have chosen not to include the song in their planning either, given that the original single of A Whiter Shade of Pale was not issued by A&M in the United States. It was issued by London Records through their DRM Records subsidiary. The last song of the album, which takes all of side 2 of the album, is It Held 'Twas Nigh, the epic piece from Procol Harum's second album, Shine On Brightly, from 1968. This is a majestic performance, with the members of Procol Harum playing exceptionally well, the orchestra with them at every turn. Gary Brooker's vocals are outstanding. The short recitation that Keith Reed gives during Glimpses of Nirvana, the first song of the suite, is delivered convincingly as well. As the story goes, Reed was apparently giving the recitation from the audience, so as to add a little bit of drama to the proceedings. The part of the song that really stands out, though, is the guitar interlude at the end of the third section of the suite, In the Autumn of My Madness. Dave Ball takes the piece that Robin Trower originally provided on the Shine On Brightly album and makes it his own. He does a terrific job powering his way through the solo and makes it exceptionally memorable indeed. The extended ovation at the closing of In Held Wasn't I is definitely a testimony to how well Procol Harum and the Edmonton Symphony Orchestra performed on this night. I would guess from the flow here that this was not constructed through creative editing at the event. Chris Thomas, who produced the album, I'm sure, took the actual applause from the final ovation of the band following It Held Wasn't I and retained that. The ovation runs for nearly a full minute at the end of the album. Procol Harum Live would become the band's best-selling album. It peaked at number 5 in the United States in the spring of 1972. It charted reasonably well in England at number 48, and it was a top 10 seller in many other territories as well. What's important, though, is the mark that it left. Procol Harum Live became something of a benchmark for live albums that incorporated orchestral backing in the future. Rick Wakeman, a couple of years later, in recording Journey to the Center of the Earth, knew that he had his hands full when presenting that album to his label, which, surprise, surprise, was also A&M Records. And I'd be willing to bet that Procol Harum's success, coupled with that of Wakeman a couple of years later, was one of the driving factors behind Keith Emerson's wanting to record and tour with an orchestra in 1976 and 1977. This album made a terrific mark, and it was a mark that lasted. When the progressive rock supergroup Transatlantic first joined forces in the year 2000, one of the very first things they recorded on their first album, Sempty, was their take on In Held Wasn't I. They do a brilliant version of it there as well. Procol Harum never equaled the success of their live album going forward. They did indeed switch labels to Chrysalis in the United States. The live album was the last album that Procol would make with A&M Records. And the album that followed the live album, Grand Hotel, was one that made significant use of orchestration as well. But while a hit, it was not as successful as Procol Harum Live. Procol Harum would never achieve that level of success again. They did, however, leave us with Procol Harum Live, and with a great catalog of albums to enjoy. I've said it in the past in comments I made in other programs on Procol Harum. If this is a band that you're not familiar with, you definitely should take the time to seek out Procol Harum Live, especially, as well as the various Procol Harum albums from the period that Robin Trower recorded with them between 1967 and 1971. You won't be disappointed. Anyway, that is all for this episode. Hope you enjoyed it as always. Feel free to leave comments if you like. I'll do my best to respond quickly. Of course, click like and hit subscribe if you're not already a member of the channel. We hope to see you again soon. You take good care. Bye-bye.